You know, it's a strange thing, but some of the most profound truths about the past are hidden in plain sight or buried just beneath the surface. Imagine this: a people with no metal tools, no beasts of burden, and no written language in the way we understand it, creating massive stone heads, some weighing over 40 tons, and moving them miles from their quarry. The sheer scale of it feels almost otherworldly, a silent challenge to our modern assumptions about what's possible. These ancient people built sprawling cities and engineered breathtaking feats, only to vanish into the mists of time, leaving behind a trail of incredible art and a profound sense of mystery. They charted the stars, created calendars of breathtaking accuracy, and developed complex spiritual worlds that still echo in the beliefs of their descendants today. It's a history of rise and fall, of incredible ingenuity and sudden, inexplicable collapse, all playing out on a stage framed by volcanoes and deep jungles. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening right now, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And so, we begin our journey far back in time with the whispers of the Olmec, the so-called mother culture of Mesoamerica. Imagine a sweltering, humid lowland landscape crisscrossed by rivers, a place of lush vegetation and abundant wildlife. Sometime around 1500 BCE, on this fertile coastal plain of what we now call Veracruz and Tabasco in modern-day Mexico, a distinct culture began to emerge. These weren't just simple farmers. They were artisans, priests, and leaders who started to shape their world in a monumental way. The Olmec were the first in this region to truly create a complex, stratified society, moving beyond scattered villages to create ceremonial centers and eventually genuine towns. Their most famous legacy, of course, is the colossal stone heads. These massive sculptures, carved from single basalt boulders, are astonishing to behold. Each one is a portrait of a distinct individual, with unique facial features and a helmet-like headdress. To this day, we still debate who these people were. Were they kings, shamans, renowned ball players? The fact that they all have similar features, broad noses, full lips, slightly almond-shaped eyes, has led to some truly wild theories over the years, from connections to ancient Africa to speculation about alien influence. While those theories are fun for a late-night chat, the consensus among scholars is that these features reflect a common physical type of the inhabitants of the region. The real mystery isn't who they were, but how they did it. The nearest basalt quarries were dozens of miles away in the Tuxtla Mountains. The heads themselves weigh anywhere from 6 to 50 tons. Imagine trying to move something that heavy without wheels, without metal tools, and over a landscape full of rivers and thick jungle. It boggles the mind. The most likely scenario, as pieced together by archaeologists, involved a monumental effort of human labor using wooden rollers, ropes, and perhaps even large rafts to float the stones down rivers during flood season. It would have been an incredible logistical challenge, a testament to the power of a ruler who could command such a massive workforce. Beyond the heads, the Olmec left behind other stunning examples of their artistry. They were masters of jade carving, creating intricate figurines and ceremonial objects with a skill that rivaled later civilizations. Their war-jaguar motif, a stylized blend of a human infant and a jaguar, appears frequently in their art and is a recurring puzzle for scholars. Was it a religious symbol? Did it represent a deity or a mythological creature? The mystery persists because, as I mentioned, the Olmec left us no detailed written records. What we know about them comes entirely from what they left behind: their sculptures, their pottery, and the layout of their ceremonial centers like La Venta and San Lorenzo. These sites show an incredible understanding of urban planning and astronomical alignment. La Venta, for example, is oriented 8 degrees west of north, a deliberate and precise placement that suggests a deep connection to the cosmos. It's in the Olmec's influence that we see the first stirrings of the broader Mesoamerican story. They weren't just a local power. Their trade networks stretched far and wide. Olmec-style artifacts have been found hundreds of miles from their heartland, suggesting a widespread exchange of ideas, goods, and cultural practices. It's here that we see the seeds of what would become the hallmarks of all later Mesoamerican civilizations: the ritual ballgame, the practice of bloodletting, the veneration of the jaguar, and the complex calendar system that would be perfected by the Maya. They were, in essence, the cultural architects, laying the foundation upon which towering empires would one day stand. And then, around 400 BCE, their great centers began to be abandoned. The reasons for this decline are not fully understood. It could have been a shift in river courses, environmental changes, or perhaps even internal strife. Whatever the cause, the mother culture faded. But the ideas and innovations they pioneered would echo for centuries to come, rippling outward and upward through the jungles and mountains of Mesoamerica. The fading echoes of the Olmec didn't mean the end of progress. It was more like the planting of new seeds. The stage was now set for the next great act, an act that had been quietly building for centuries. To understand what came next, we need to zoom in on something seemingly simple, but utterly revolutionary: a humble little grass that would become the cornerstone of an entire civilization. I'm talking about maize, or what you and I know as corn. Before the Olmec, the people of Mesoamerica were largely nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons and the available game. They had a decent life, but it was a life constantly on the move, a bit like a perpetual road trip with no fixed address. But somewhere around 7000 BCE, in a small area of what is now the central Balsas River Valley, a genetic miracle occurred. A wild grass called teosinte was, through generations of human selection and careful cultivation, transformed into the plant we recognize today. The shift was profound. Teosinte has a single small stalk with a few kernels. Corn has a big fat cob full of them. The difference was like going from a single-person canoe to a cargo ship. This domestication of maize didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, but it was the single most important factor in the transition from a nomadic lifestyle to sedentism, the practice of staying in one place. With a reliable, calorie-rich food source, people could stop chasing their dinner and start building permanent homes. They could store surplus food, which meant they could survive lean times and support larger families. This is the moment when villages begin to appear, not just temporary camps, but settled communities. It was the invention of a sort of home base, a central hub from which life could be organized. You could say it was the invention of the suburb, but with less lawn care and more obsidian-tipped spears. With a stable food supply, a chain reaction of innovation and specialization began. Not everyone had to spend their days hunting or foraging. Some people could specialize in making pottery to store that surplus food. Others could learn to weave textiles. Still others could become full-time farmers, developing more sophisticated irrigation techniques. This specialization led to the development of social hierarchies. A community leader, or a respected elder, might coordinate planting and harvesting schedules, or mediate disputes. A shaman might emerge to interpret the will of the gods and ensure a good harvest. These roles weren't just social. They were essential for the survival and prosperity of the entire community. It was the beginning of organized society as we know it, all thanks to that unassuming grass. The shift to sedentary village life also created a need for more complex social structures and, in turn, a greater need for ceremonial spaces. The earliest villages, in places like Oaxaca and the Valley of Mexico, were simple collections of wattle and daub huts. But over time, they began to include public spaces for rituals and ceremonies. These shared spaces served to unify the community, to reinforce shared beliefs and traditions. These weren't grand pyramids yet, but they were the embryonic form of the temple complexes that would one day dot the landscape. A central plaza might be used for festivals, a raised platform for a chief's home, or a shaman's ritual. You can almost see the gears of civilization starting to turn, each innovation building on the last. Archaeologists have spent countless hours meticulously sifting through the dirt of these early sites, like the village of San Jose Mogote in Oaxaca. Looking for clues to this transformative period, they found evidence of early pottery, of small-scale irrigation, and even of rudimentary social stratification in the way some burials are more elaborate than others. The big scholarly debate here is whether this transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer was a slow, creeping evolution or a more rapid, revolutionary shift. Was it a series of small, logical steps? Or was there a pivotal moment where people realized, hey, we can just stay here and grow our own food? The evidence seems to point to a more gradual process, a long period of experimentation and adaptation. It wasn't a light switch being flipped. It was more like the slow, deliberate turning of a massive flywheel. And so, as the Olmec faded into history, these new, maize-fed communities began to grow in power and population. They were laying the groundwork, not just for one new culture, but for a whole mosaic of them. In the highlands of Oaxaca, the people who would become the Zapotec were already establishing a presence. In the lowlands, the ancestors of the Maya were doing the same. In the Valley of Mexico, the seeds of future empires were being sown. The story of Mesoamerica is, in many ways, the story of this agricultural revolution. It all started with a small, unremarkably looking grass, which, through human ingenuity and a whole lot of elbow grease, became the foundation for everything that followed: the art, the cities, the gods, and the empires. And with this new way of life came a new way of thinking, a new way of organizing society, and a new chapter in our story. With the groundwork of settled life firmly in place, the story shifts eastward and into the highlands of Oaxaca, a region of dramatic mountains and fertile valleys. Here, a civilization was quietly coming into its own, building upon the agricultural and social innovations that had now taken root. These people, whom we call the Zapotec, would create one of the earliest and most enduring state-level societies in Mesoamerica. If the Olmec were the pioneers who first carved a path through the jungle, the Zapotec were the master builders who constructed the first true cities along it. Their story is inextricably linked to one place, a massive flattened mountaintop overlooking the three main valleys of the region. This was the site of Monte Alban, a truly epic feat of engineering and urban planning. The Zapotec didn't just build a city on this mountaintop. They literally carved it out of the mountain itself. Starting around 500 BCE, they began leveling the summit, creating a vast flat platform for their temples, palaces, and plazas. This wasn't a defensive fortification, though its position was certainly commanding. It was a deliberate ceremonial statement of power and prestige, a city built closer to the heavens. Monte Alban wasn't just a capital. It was the heart of the Zapotec world, a political and religious nexus that would endure for over a millennium. At its peak, Monte Alban was home to tens of thousands of people, and its influence stretched far beyond the immediate valley. But what made the Zapotec so influential? Well, they were innovators, and two of their most significant contributions would become central to nearly all later Mesoamerican civilizations: the development of writing and a sophisticated calendar system. On a stone slab in Monte Alban, known as the danzantes, the dancers, archaeologists found carvings that depict strange, contorted figures. These figures are now widely believed to be war captives, and accompanying them are glyphs, early forms of writing. These weren't just simple pictures. They were a system of symbols representing names, dates, and places. It's an open scholarly debate whether these glyphs were a fully functional phonetic writing system or a more limited logosyllabic one. But what's clear is that they represent one of the earliest forms of written communication in the Americas. This was the birth of history being recorded, not just passed down through oral tradition. Hand in hand with their writing, the Zapotec developed a remarkable understanding of time. They used a dual calendar system, a marvel of ancient timekeeping. There was a 260-day ritual calendar, or Tonalpohualli, used for divination and ceremonies, and a 365-day solar calendar, or Xiuhpohualli, that tracked the agricultural year. These two cycles, running in parallel, created a 52-year calendar round before they would align again. Think of it like two interlocking gears. It was a system that allowed them to predict astronomical events, schedule planting and harvesting, and most importantly, create a sense of order and cosmic significance in their lives. The accuracy of this system is something that would be further refined by the Maya and others, but the Zapotec were among the first to master it. It was a truly profound intellectual achievement, like building a clock from scratch without having ever seen a clock before. The Zapotec also excelled at pottery and stone carving, with their funerary urns being particularly famous. These urns, often found in elaborate tombs, depict deities and ancestors, offering a glimpse into their rich spiritual world. Their tombs, in fact, are a fascinating aspect of their culture. They were often constructed beneath the floors of homes, creating a direct link between the living and the dead. The ancestors weren't just remembered. They were a very real and present part of daily life. something that resonates with many cultures today. You could say their ancestors were always a part of the family, just with less small talk at dinner. For over 1,000 years, Monte Alban was a beacon of power and culture. The city flourished, its population grew, and its influence spread. But around 800 CE, something started to change. The city was not violently conquered, but rather its great temples and palaces were abandoned. The population dispersed into the surrounding valleys, and new, smaller political centers emerged. The reasons for this decline are another great historical mystery. Was it environmental degradation, internal conflict, or perhaps the rise of new competing powers in the region? The Zapotec people didn't disappear. Their descendants still live in Oaxaca today. But the great city of Monte Alban became a ghost town, a silent testament to a once mighty civilization. The legacy of their writing and calendar, however, was already in motion, spreading across the highlands and lowlands, ready to be picked up by the next great culture to emerge from the Mesoamerican crucible. While the Zapotec were busy carving a city out of a mountaintop, another story was unfolding to the east. In the dense jungles and low-lying plains of what is now Guatemala, Belize, and the Yucatan Peninsula, this was the home of the Maya, a civilization whose story would become synonymous with Mesoamerica itself. But before the great stone pyramids and the celestial observations, there was a formative period, a time of slow and steady growth, known as the pre-classic Maya, which lasted from roughly 2000 BC to 250 CE. Think of it as the opening act of a long and very complicated play. In these early centuries, the ancestors of the Maya were a patchwork of small, independent farming villages. The humid climate, while challenging, was also incredibly fertile. And with the mastery of maize cultivation, these communities were able to flourish. They weren't building sprawling cities yet. They were focused on survival, on taming the jungle, and on developing the core beliefs and practices that would later define their culture. This was the time when the fundamental pieces of the Maya world were put into place, much like assembling the foundation of a massive building, one brick at a time. The first pottery, the first permanent houses, the first public rituals, all of these emerged during this time. The most fascinating part of the pre-classic is watching these small villages evolve into something much more complex. As populations grew, so did the need for organization and leadership. We see the first stirrings of social hierarchy, with some individuals and families gaining more influence than others. And with that influence came the first attempts at monumental architecture. At sites like El Mirador in Guatemala, something truly remarkable was taking shape as early as 300 BCE. Here, the Maya were building pyramids on a scale that would rival anything they would create in their more famous classic period. The La Danta Pyramid, for example, is one of the largest pyramids by volume in the world, a colossal structure that dominates the jungle canopy. It's a testament to the fact that the Maya were not some quaint, jungle-dwelling people who suddenly got serious about building. They were already building on a grand scale, long before many of the more famous cities were even a glimmer in an architect's eye. The existence of these early massive structures presents one of the great historiographic mysteries of Maya history. Who were the people who built them? What kind of political or social organization could command the labor to construct something like La Danta? The scale of these buildings suggests a powerful, centralized authority, but the evidence for a unified kingdom is sparse. Were they led by powerful divine kings, as would be the case later? Or was it a different kind of leadership? And what happened to them? The great pre-classic centers, like El Mirador and Nakbe, were largely abandoned by the time the classic Maya period began. It's as if they built these incredible cities, then just walked away, leaving behind a profound and lingering puzzle. In addition to their architectural achievements, the pre-classic Maya were also refining many of the cultural traits we associate with them today. They were adopting the dual calendar system pioneered by the Zapotec and others, and they were beginning to develop their own complex writing system. The earliest examples of Maya glyphs, which would become one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world, can be found on stelae and pottery from this period. They were also developing their rich cosmology, including a pantheon of gods and a complex understanding of the cosmos. The ritual ball game, played with a heavy rubber ball on purpose-built courts, was also a feature of these early societies, blending sport, ritual, and politics in a way that would be central to Maya life for centuries to come. You could say it was the world's first major sports league, but with higher stakes than just a trophy. It's easy to think of the classic Maya as the only Maya, but the pre-classic period is the bedrock upon which all their later glory was built. It was a time of experimentation and growth, of villages slowly transforming into city-states, of simple beliefs morphing into a complex and beautiful worldview. It was a time when the potential of a people was being realized on a monumental scale, even if that scale was later eclipsed by the fame of places like Tikal and Palenque. The pre-classic Maya were the ones who figured it all out, the ones who laid the tracks for the civilization to come. And when we look at the breathtaking size of their early pyramids, we can only marvel at their ambition and the silent, enduring mystery of their final days. As the Maya were laying the foundations of their future city-states, a new power was taking shape to the west, in the heart of central Mexico. The year is roughly 100 BCE, and on a sprawling, fertile plain in the Valley of Mexico, a city was being born that would one day become one of the largest in the ancient world. This was Teotihuacan, a name that means the birthplace of the gods in the later Aztec language, a city so grand and so mysterious that even the Aztecs, centuries later, believed it was built by giants. It wasn't just a city. It was a phenomenon, a massive urban center that would exert its influence for centuries across the entire Mesoamerican world. Unlike the Maya cities that grew organically from small villages, Teotihuacan seems to have sprung into existence almost fully formed. A planned metropolis laid out on a meticulous grid plan. This level of foresight and urban planning is breathtaking. At its core was the magnificent Avenue of the Dead, a grand north-south thoroughfare that served as the city's main artery. Along this avenue stood the city's most iconic structures, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. The Pyramid of the Sun, a colossal structure built over a natural cave, is one of the largest pyramids in the world. It's hard to imagine the scale of the effort required to build it, all without metal tools. It's so big, in fact, that it was built as a single, monumental construction project, not in stages like many others. The sheer size of Teotihuacan is what sets it apart. At its peak, around 450 CE, its population may have swelled to over 150,000 people, making it the sixth largest city in the world at the time. This was a true metropolis, a melting pot of different peoples and cultures. We know from archaeological evidence that people from Oaxaca, the Gulf Coast, and the Maya region lived in distinct, ethnically separate neighborhoods. This isn't a small town we're talking about. It's a bustling, diverse urban hub, a bit like a Silicon Valley for ancient Mesoamerica. And it wasn't just a place of residence. It was a center of industry. Teotihuacan controlled the obsidian trade, a volcanic class that was essential for making sharp tools and weapons. By controlling this crucial resource, they became an economic powerhouse, a sort of ancient Amazon, but with more impressive stonework. The religious and political life of Teotihuacan, however, is one of the great scholarly mysteries. We don't know who its rulers were. Unlike the Maya, who carved portraits of their kings and queens on stelae, there are no depictions of specific Teotihuacan rulers. We have magnificent art, like the stunning murals of the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, and the storm god Tlaloc. But there are no named individuals. Who held power? Was it a king? A council of priests? A collective body? The ongoing debate centers on this very question. Was Teotihuacan an impersonal state ruled by a powerful oligarchy, or was there a dynastic line that has simply been erased from the historical record? The lack of evidence for a specific ruling lineage is a puzzle that continues to baffle archaeologists, adding to the city's enigmatic aura. Despite this, Teotihuacan's influence was undeniable and far-reaching. Its architectural style, with its distinctive talud tablero design, a sloping base topped by a vertical panel, can be found at sites hundreds of miles away. Its art, its gods, and its economic power spread throughout Mesoamerica, from the Gulf Coast to the highlands of Oaxaca, and deep into the Maya lowlands. We even find evidence of Teotihuacan's military presence and political meddling in Maya cities like Tikal, where a new ruling dynasty was established with the help of Teotihuacan warriors. It's like they were a sort of ancient superpower, projecting their soft and hard power across the continent. They were a force to be reckoned with, a hub of culture, trade, and political intrigue that dominated the Mesoamerican stage. And for 5 centuries, Teotihuacan was the undisputed champion, a city of gods and giants that cast a long shadow over every other civilization. But, as with all great empires, that shadow would eventually begin to fade, leading to one of the most abrupt and dramatic collapses in ancient history, as the colossal city of Teotihuacan began to cast its long shadow across Mesoamerica. The very first great civilization, the Olmec, had already been fading for centuries. The story of the Olmec's mysterious decline is a slow-motion narrative of abandonment and environmental change, a quiet ending rather than a violent one. The great centers of the Olmec heartland, San Lorenzo and La Venta, which had once been bustling hubs of ceremony and trade, were gradually abandoned, their monuments toppled and defaced. By around 400 BCE, the Olmec, as a distinct, powerful culture, had ceased to exist, leaving behind only the silent sentinels of their colossal stone heads and the profound cultural legacy they had bequeathed to others. The great scholarly debate surrounding the Olmec's decline isn't about a single cataclysmic event. there are no signs of a massive invasion or a devastating earthquake that brought everything to a halt. Instead, the theories point to a more gradual and perhaps more complicated confluence of factors. One of the leading hypotheses focuses on the environment. The Olmec heartland, the coastal plains of Veracruz and Tabasco, is a dynamic landscape. The rivers that once served as crucial trade and transportation arteries could have shifted their courses, making once fertile land less productive and once accessible trade routes impassable. Imagine a civilization built on river trade suddenly finding its main thoroughfare turned into a swamp. That would be a pretty big logistical nightmare, right? Another theory suggests a kind of internal social upheaval. Perhaps the concentration of power in the hands of a few rulers, as evidenced by the massive effort required to create and move the stone heads, became unsustainable. There may have been revolts or a breakdown of the social contract that held the society together. Without a powerful central authority to command the labor and resources, the great ceremonial centers would have become unmanageable. The toppling and burial of some of the colossal heads could be seen as a sign of this internal strife, a symbolic rejection of the rulers they once represented. We also can't ignore the possibility of external pressure. While the Olmec weren't conquered, the rise of competing regional centers and the diversification of trade routes may have eroded their economic power. As other groups, like the early Zapotec and Maya, began to develop their own agricultural and artistic traditions, the Olmec's role as the sole cultural and economic hub would have diminished. It's a bit like a once dominant tech company that gets surpassed by a dozen different startups. Their influence doesn't disappear overnight, but their singular preeminence slowly wanes until they're just one player among many. The most fascinating aspect of the Olmec decline is that it wasn't a cultural extinction. The people didn't vanish into thin air. Instead, the Olmec traditions and ideas were absorbed, transformed, and carried forward by their neighbors. The ritual ball game, the calendar, the jaguar motif, and even some of the artistic styles continued to appear in later cultures. The Olmec were, in essence, the cultural yeast of Mesoamerica. They started the fermentation process, and while the original culture itself eventually died out, its creative energy lived on in the civilizations that followed. The Maya, for example, took the Olmec's early calendar ideas and refined them into an incredibly accurate and complex system. The Zapotec took the Olmec's nascent writing and developed their own powerful script. So the end of the Olmec was less a tragic fall and more a gentle, organic transformation. Their great ceremonial centers were swallowed by the jungle. Their stone monuments stood as silent testament to a forgotten age. But their ideas and innovations lived on, bubbling up in new cultures with new names and new ideas. The story of the Olmec reminds us that even a mother culture can eventually fade, but its children can carry its legacy to new and greater heights. And as we leave the fading footprints of the Olmec behind, we turn our attention back to the Maya, who in this post-Olmec world were about to enter their golden age, an era of competing city-states, powerful kings, and stunning artistic and intellectual achievement. The stage had been set, and the main players were now ready to take the spotlight. With the Olmec now a memory and the great city of Teotihuacan rising to power, we arrive at the golden age of the Maya, the so-called Classic period, which stretched from roughly 250 to 900 CE. This was a time of unprecedented growth intellectual achievement, and intense political drama. Imagine a landscape of dense jungle, punctuated not by sleepy villages, but by towering limestone pyramids, ornate palaces, and sprawling plazas, all interconnected by a web of alliances, trade routes, and more often than not, warfare. This wasn't a single Maya empire, but rather a collection of powerful, independent city-states, each with its own divine king, its own political ambitions, and its own unique artistic style. Our story now focuses on one of the most magnificent of these city-states, Tikal. Located in the lowlands of what is now northern Guatemala, Tikal was a metropolis of staggering scale, its population swelling to perhaps 100,000 people at its peak. Its skyline was dominated by towering pyramids, many of them serving as funerary temples for its powerful rulers. The most famous of these, Temple Tapanch, known as the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rises over 47 meters above the jungle floor, a silent testament to the power of a king named Jaso Chan Ka Wil Hoing. These were not just religious monuments. They were the ultimate expression of royal power, connecting the earthly ruler to the celestial realm. But Tikal wasn't alone. It was locked in a fierce and often bloody rivalry with its neighbor Calakmul, located to the north in modern-day Mexico. Think of it as an ancient Cold War, or maybe more like a very hot one, with these two superpowers vying for regional dominance. They didn't just fight each other. They fought a proxy war, each trying to install puppet rulers in smaller, weaker city-states. This political landscape was a complex, ever-shifting mosaic of alliances and betrayals. A king in one city might be a staunch ally of Tikal one year and a vassal of Calakmul the next. The constant warfare was a defining feature of the classic period, something we know from the detailed hieroglyphic texts carved on stone stelae and pottery. These texts, now mostly deciphered, provide us with a detailed and surprisingly personal history of this era, a bit like reading the ancient equivalent of a gossip column and a war chronicle all at once. This is where one of the great scholarly debates of Maya history comes in. For a long time, scholars believed the Maya were a peaceful, contemplative people, a sort of ancient version of forest-dwelling philosophers. They focused on the beautiful art, the intricate calendars, and the advanced astronomy. But the decipherment of the glyphs in the latter half of the 20th century shattered that romantic image. What they revealed was a world of brutal warfare, of captive sacrifice, of political assassination, and of divine kings who constantly went to war to prove their power and secure their legacy. The stelae, which were once thought to be just religious symbols, were actually royal propaganda, glorifying the triumphs of a ruler in battle. This discovery completely rewrote our understanding of the classic Maya, revealing a society that was just as complex, ambitious, and violent as any other great civilization. Beyond the politics and the warfare, the classic Maya were an astonishingly creative and intelligent people. They perfected the calendar systems they inherited from the Olmec and Zapotec, creating the long count, a linear calendar that could track time for thousands of years. They were master astronomers, capable of predicting eclipses and mapping the movements of the planets with incredible accuracy. Their writing system was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, a blend of phonetic and logographic glyphs that allowed them to record history, myths, and even poetry. Their art, from the delicate carving of jade to the breathtaking murals of Bonampak, speaks of a culture of immense aesthetic refinement. The classic period was a cultural explosion, a time when all the pieces of the Mesoamerican puzzle came together to create something truly magnificent. The divine kings, with their celestial authority and their insatiable appetite for power, presided over a world of incredible beauty and brutal competition. But just as the era had a clear beginning, it also had a clear, though still debated, end. Around 900 CE, the great cities of the southern lowlands, places like Tikal, Calakmul, and Palenque, went into a rapid and dramatic decline. They were abandoned, their magnificent temples left to the encroaching jungle. The end of the classic period would mark one of the most perplexing mysteries in all of archaeology, a sudden and silent collapse that still haunts us to this day. While the great Maya city-states were at their peak, locked in their endless rivalries and building their breathtaking pyramids, something was going very wrong back in central Mexico. The city of Teotihuacan, the birthplace of the gods and the undisputed superpower of the region, was in the throes of a dramatic and definitive collapse. This wasn't a slow, gradual decline like that of the Olmec, but a sudden and catastrophic event that brought the great city to its knees. Around 550 CE, Teotihuacan, which had stood for centuries as a beacon of power and a hub of culture, was violently destroyed. The great temples along the Avenue of the Dead were burned, their statues toppled, and the city's heart was essentially put to the torch. This event, known to archaeologists as Teotihuacan's Great Collapse, is one of the most significant and perplexing historical mysteries of Mesoamerica. The physical evidence of this destruction is undeniable. Layers of burnt earth and ash cover the central ceremonial core of the city. The great murals, which once adorned the walls of palaces and temples, show signs of deliberate defacement. The homes of the elite were targeted, but the homes of the common people were largely spared. This suggests that the destruction wasn't the result of a random external invasion that sacked the entire city. Instead, it points to a more specific, targeted act of violence, a sort of ancient coup d'etat or a popular uprising. This is the heart of the scholarly debate. Who was responsible for this, and why? One prominent theory is that the collapse was the result of an internal revolt. Teotihuacan was a highly stratified society with a powerful, faceless elite who ruled from grand palaces, while the majority of the population lived in more modest apartment compounds. Over centuries, social tensions could have built up, perhaps fueled by a period of drought or crop failures. A popular uprising, targeting the ruling class and their symbols of power, would explain why the elite centers were burned and defaced, while the rest of the city remained largely intact. It would have been a moment of cathartic violence, a settling of ancient scores that ultimately destroyed the very thing it sought to overthrow. You can almost imagine the angry shouts echoing down the Avenue of the Dead as the temples burned. Another theory points to external forces. While Teotihuacan was the dominant power, its influence was not always benevolent. It had likely made enemies during its centuries of expansion and control over trade. As the city's power began to wane, perhaps due to environmental stress or internal problems, other competing powers in the Valley of Mexico and beyond may have seized the opportunity to strike. The city of Tula, which would later become the capital of the Toltecs, was a growing power in the region, and it's not unthinkable that they or another rival city may have played a role. However, the evidence for a massive invading army is not there. This makes the internal uprising theory a bit more compelling. But the possibility of a coordinated attack by regional rivals cannot be completely ruled out. It's a bit like trying to solve a crime scene 1,000 years after the fact, with only a few burned walls and toppled statues as evidence. Whatever the immediate cause, the collapse of Teotihuacan sent shockwaves throughout Mesoamerica. The loss of such a massive and influential hub created a power vacuum that would last for centuries. The great trade networks, which had been centered on Teotihuacan's control of obsidian, were disrupted. The stability and order that the city had provided were gone. As Teotihuacan burned, its population dispersed. Its powerful deities, like Quetzalcoatl, were adopted by other cultures, and its legacy was transformed into myth. The city became a pilgrimage site for later peoples, like the Aztecs, who would travel to the city of the gods to revere the monuments of a civilization they did not understand. The fall of Teotihuacan is a powerful reminder that even the most impressive and seemingly eternal empires are ultimately fragile. It was a city that lacked the dynastic glorification of the Maya, and in the end, it was perhaps that very facelessness that contributed to its downfall. Without a single, recognizable ruler to rally behind, the social contract may have been too weak to withstand the pressure of a crisis. Its sudden collapse marked the end of the early classic period in central Mexico and opened the door for a new era, one of competing city-states and a more militaristic worldview that would eventually culminate in the rise of the Toltecs and, much later, the Aztecs. The silence that fell over the Avenue of the Dead would last for hundreds of years. As Teotihuacan burned and its influence waned, the Maya of the classic period continued to build, battle, and innovate. With the great superpower of central Mexico no longer dominating the scene, the various Maya city-states were free to pursue their own ambitions, and they did so with gusto. This was a world defined by a new level of intense Maya warfare and royal power, where the glory of a divine king was often measured in the blood of his enemies. The once romanticized image of the contemplative, peaceful Maya has been utterly replaced by the reality of a world of cutthroat politics and constant conflict. The decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs has given us a front row seat to this dramatic period. We now have a clear picture of what a Maya king or a Jaw actually did. He wasn't just a spiritual leader or a calendar keeper. He was a living god on earth, a descendant of the celestial deities, and his primary responsibility was to maintain the cosmic order through ritual and, most importantly, through warfare. The stelae and lintels of cities like Yaxchilan and Piedras Negras are not just monuments. They are ancient propaganda films depicting rulers in magnificent regalia, holding their captive enemies by the hair or standing triumphantly over them. This wasn't just about conquering territory. It was about capturing rivals for ritual sacrifice and enhancing the glory of the king. You could say it was the ultimate form of humble bragging. A crucial aspect of Maya warfare was the concept of the Star War. These weren't battles in space, but ritual wars tied to specific astronomical events. Often, the heliacal rising of the planet Venus. When the morning star appeared, it was considered an auspicious time to attack a rival city-state. This belief demonstrates the deep connection between Maya warfare, religion, and astronomy. The king's military prowess was not just a matter of strategy, it was a matter of divine sanction. Capturing a rival king was the ultimate prize. The captured ruler would often be publicly humiliated, tortured, and eventually sacrificed, a fate far worse than death, as it meant the complete destruction of his spiritual and political authority. We even have glyphs that tell us precisely what happened, a terrifyingly detailed record of these ritualized displays of power. The constant state of warfare had a profound impact on Maya society. It drove the construction of impressive defensive works, like the walls around the city of Bacan. It also created a powerful warrior elite and a class of skilled artisans who were tasked with glorifying the king's victories. The magnificent murals of Bonampak, for example, show a vivid and detailed depiction of a battle and the subsequent torture of the captives, a rare glimpse into the brutal realities of royal power. The constant need for new captives for sacrifice and new tribute from defeated polities created an economic and social pressure cooker, with city-states rising and falling based on the fortunes of war. One of the great historical mysteries of this period is the role of the queen, or Ixajau. While the kings are often the focus of the stele, we have discovered evidence of powerful female rulers and royal women who played a significant role in politics, especially in forming alliances through marriage. Lady Zok of Yachilan is a particularly famous example, depicted in a series of stunning lintels performing a bloodletting ritual to summon her ancestor and presiding over the capture of a rival ruler. This suggests that the power structure was not a simple male-dominated hierarchy, but a more complex and nuanced system where women could wield significant influence, sometimes behind the scenes and sometimes right out in the open. However, this period of intense political and military competition, while artistically and intellectually vibrant, was also deeply unsustainable. The constant warfare and the demands of a growing stratified population began to strain the resources of the environment. As the classic period drew to a close, the very things that had made it so glorious, the powerful kings, the massive construction projects, the unending wars, would contribute to its eventual downfall. The divine kings, who had claimed to maintain cosmic order, were perhaps too focused on fighting each other to notice the cracks forming beneath their feet. The stage was being set for the great collapse of the southern lowlands, a puzzle that would haunt archaeologists for generations and mark the end of the classic Maya era. The dramatic end of Teotihuacan left a power vacuum in central Mexico, a space that would not stay empty for long. From the chaos and migration of peoples who scattered after the great city's fall, a new power began to emerge, one that would redefine the political and cultural landscape of the post-classic period. We are now talking about the Toltecs, a group of people who would rise to prominence in the period from roughly 900 to 1150 CE. Their story is a fascinating blend of historical fact and swirling myth, as they were revered and romanticized by later civilizations, especially the Aztecs, who considered them to be the epitome of cultural and military excellence. The name Toltec, in fact, came to mean artisan or skilled worker, a testament to their reputation. The heart of the Toltec world was their capital city, Tolan, a name that simply means place of reeds, and later became synonymous with any large urban center. Today, We know this site as Tula, located in the modern state of Hidalgo, Mexico. It wasn't as sprawling as Teotihuacan, but it was a formidable city in its own right, with a population that may have reached 40,000 people. At its core stood two large pyramids, one dedicated to the morning star, or Quetzalcoatl, and the other to the war god Tezcatlipoca. But what really sets Tula apart are the giant stone warriors, the Atlantean figures that stand atop the pyramid of Quetzalcoatl. These 15-foot-tall basalt sculptures, each one a fierce warrior holding an atlatl, a spear thrower, are a powerful symbol of the militaristic society that the Toltecs created. Unlike Teotihuacan, whose rulers remain anonymous, the Toltecs had a strong, identifiable ruling class. The legends passed down by the Aztecs tell of a great ruler named Teotihuacan Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, a name that combines his personal name with the title of the Feathered Serpent God. This Toltec ruler was a priest and a patron of the arts, but he was eventually driven out of Tula by his rival, the war-hungry god Tezcatlipoca, a story that likely represents an internal conflict between two competing factions or ideologies within the Toltec elite. The legend says that Quetzalcoatl departed Tula and sailed eastward, vowing one day to return. This legend would have an immense and unintended consequence centuries later, as you can probably already guess. The militarism of the Toltecs was a key part of their cultural identity. They were skilled warriors, and their influence spread far and wide through conquest and trade. Their art, while beautiful, often depicts scenes of violence and sacrifice. Their distinctive art style, featuring warriors, feathered serpents, and symbols of death, can be found at sites far from Tula, most notably at the Maya city of Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula. The presence of these Toltec-style monuments and artistic motifs at a major Maya city is one of the great scholarly debates of the period. Did the Toltecs conquer Chichen Itza? Or was it more a case of cultural diffusion, where the Maya of Chichen Itza simply adopted the militaristic iconography and prestige of the Toltec civilization? The current consensus leans toward a more complex relationship, a mix of trade, migration, and the adoption of a popular and powerful cultural style. Whatever the answer, the connection shows just how influential the Toltecs were. The Toltecs' reign, however, was relatively short-lived. Around 1150 CE, their capital city of Tula was destroyed and abandoned, much like Teotihuacan before it. The cause of this collapse is another one of those historical mysteries that keeps archaeologists up at night. Was it internal strife, as hinted at in the legend of Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca? Or was it external pressure from the nomadic Chichimeca peoples who were moving into the region? The evidence points to a combination of factors. The city was burned. The giant statues of the Atlantean warriors were pushed off their perch, and the Toltec people dispersed, carrying their legacy of art, religion, and warfare with them. Their collapse didn't mean they were forgotten. Quite the opposite. The Toltecs became a source of cultural legitimacy for all who came after. For the Aztecs, to claim descent from the Toltecs was to claim a heritage of greatness, to be part of a golden age that was now lost. The Toltecs, in their rise and their fall, had laid the final piece of the puzzle that would be needed for the next great empire to emerge. With the great cities of the classic Maya period now lying mostly abandoned in the southern lowlands, the spotlight on the Maya world shifted north to the flat and arid Yucatan Peninsula. This new era, known as the post-classic Maya period, which lasted from roughly 900 to 1520 CE, was a time of change, adaptation, and a surprising resurgence of Maya culture. The monolithic divine kingships of the past were largely gone, replaced by a new political order, a bit more decentralized, and a lot more, well, Toltec influenced. The post-classic period is largely defined by the rise of new centers of power in the north, particularly the city of Chichen Itza. Unlike the earlier Maya cities that were deep in the jungle, Chichen Itza was strategically located, controlling access to important cenotes or natural sinkholes, which were the main sources of fresh water in the region. The city was a true hub of culture, trade, and pilgrimage, and its architecture is a fascinating blend of traditional Maya styles and the new militaristic Toltec influence we talked about. You can see it everywhere. In the giant serpent columns of the Temple of Kukulkan, the Maya version of Quetzalcoatl, in the carved skull racks, Tzompantli, and in the representations of Toltec warriors that adorn its buildings. Chichen Itza's rise to power is one of the more contentious points of Maya archaeology. Did the city fall under the political control of the Toltecs from central Mexico, as some early scholars believed? Or did a group of Maya people in the Yucatan simply adopt the fashionable and powerful Toltec cultural style to legitimize their own rule? The current scholarly consensus leans towards the latter, suggesting that the inhabitants of Chichen Itza, likely a group known as the Itza, incorporated Toltec ideas and iconography to create a new hybrid style that was both Maya and distinctly post-classic. It was a new way of doing things, a move from a divine king to a more collective form of leadership, perhaps a council of elite families or warriors. It was a bit like a city adopting a new corporate logo to seem more modern and powerful. The city flourished for several centuries, becoming a magnet for pilgrims from across the Maya world. Its famous El Castillo, or the Pyramid of Kukulkan, is a masterpiece of astronomical alignment. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun casts a shadow on the staircase that looks like a serpent slithering down to the earth. A truly breathtaking spectacle that still draws crowds today. The Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza is the largest in all of Mesoamerica, a testament to the continued importance of the ritual ball game, a game that often ended with the sacrifice of the losing team's captain. It's hard to imagine that level of sports fandom today, although maybe some football coaches would be willing to go there. After Chichen Itza's decline around 1280 CE, power in the Yucatan shifted again, this time to the city of Mayapan. Mayapan wasn't as grand or artistically rich as its predecessor, but it was a politically dominant force. It was the capital of a confederation of noble families who ruled the region collectively, a sort of oligarchy that controlled a vast network of smaller city-states. The city itself was a bustling, fortified urban center, but its rule was not without internal strife. The constant jockeying for power between the various noble families eventually led to a civil war, and by 1441, Mayapan was sacked and abandoned, bringing an end to the last great Maya capital before the arrival of the Spanish. The period after Mayapan's fall saw the Yucatan fragment into a series of smaller, independent city-states, each with its own ruler. This political fragmentation, while perhaps not ideal for grand pyramid building, did allow Maya culture to survive and adapt in a different form. The post-classic Maya continued to be masters of trade, navigating the Caribbean coast in massive canoes, and their calendar and writing systems continued to be used, especially in places like the highlands of Guatemala. The post-classic Maya were not a dying civilization. They were a resilient people, adapting to a new political and environmental reality. And as they carved out a new existence in the north, far from the collapsed cities of their ancestors, a new group of people were making their own history in central Mexico, a group who would eventually become known as the most powerful and feared empire in the Americas. As the Maya world was shifting and reorganizing in the Yucatan, the story returns to the dramatic highlands of Oaxaca. Here, in the wake of the Zapotecs' decline and the abandonment of Monte Alban, a new and remarkable culture was coming into its own, the Mixtec. The Zapotec hadn't vanished, but the political landscape had fragmented, allowing the Mixtec people to rise to prominence, especially from around 1000 CE onward. The Mixtec were not just successors to the Zapotec. They were brilliant artists, prolific historians, and master craftsmen who left behind a legacy that, in some ways, is even more intimate and detailed than that of their predecessors. The Mixtec didn't build a single monumental capital like Monte Alban. Instead, they lived in a series of powerful, independent city-states, each ruled by a hereditary lord and his lineage. These lordships were often linked through complex networks of royal marriages and political alliances. This system, while sometimes leading to conflict, also fostered a rich and dynamic culture, as each lord vied with his rivals for prestige and power. We know so much about this period because of the incredible gift the Mixtec left for us, their painted books or codices. These codices are one of the great treasures of Mesoamerican archaeology. Painted on deerskin, folded into an accordion-like shape, they are visual narratives that tell the stories of the Mixtec elite. They are filled with vivid, colorful images and glyphs that record the genealogies of their rulers, their conquests, their marriages, and their religious ceremonies. It's a bit like having a meticulously illustrated family photo album and a history textbook all rolled into one, allowing us to trace the lives of specific individuals over many generations. We can, for example, trace the life and conquests of a legendary ruler named Lord Eight Deer Jaguar Claw, who lived in the 11th century. The codices show him being born, marrying into a royal family, conquering his enemies, and ultimately being sacrificed. This level of historical detail, from an indigenous perspective, is almost unheard of in the Americas and provides a stunningly personal window into the post-classic world. The Mixtec were also renowned for their artistry, particularly their work with gold and turquoise. They were master goldsmiths, creating exquisite jewelry, intricate masks, and ritual objects using techniques like lost wax casting. The famous gold mask of the sun god, found in a tomb at Monte Alban, is a testament to their incredible skill. They were also famous for their polychrome pottery, painted with beautiful and complex designs. Their aesthetic, with its fine lines and vibrant colors, is instantly recognizable and a clear departure from the styles of earlier cultures. This artistry was not just for decoration. It was an integral part of their religious and political life, meant to glorify the gods and the ruling elite. One of the great scholarly debates surrounding the Mixtec is their relationship with the Zapotec. When the Mixtec began to rise to power, they didn't simply replace the Zapotec. They coexisted with them in a complex relationship of intermarriage, conquest, and cultural exchange. In fact, some Mixtec nobles even took over Zapotec royal lines, a process that is recorded in their codices. The famous Tomb 7 at Monte Alban, a Zapotec burial chamber, was later reused by a Mixtec lord who filled it with magnificent gold and turquoise treasures. This tells us that the Mixtec didn't see Monte Alban as a foreign city, but as a sacred site, a place of power and history that they could claim as their own. It's a fascinating example of how cultures can blend and adapt rather than simply wipe each other out. The Mixtec, with their vibrant art and their detailed codices, offer us a profound and intimate look at the Mesoamerican past. They remind us that history is not just about the big empires and the grand cities, but also about the individual lives of kings and queens, their triumphs and their tragedies. As they continued to flourish in the highlands, a new group of people, who were at the time little more than nomadic outcasts, were making their way into the Valley of Mexico, a group who would eventually forge the last great empire of the Americas and give us the name of the civilization that would dominate its final act. As the Mixtec were writing their history in exquisite codices, and the post-classic Maya were adapting to a new world, a new group of people were wandering into the Valley of Mexico. These were the Mexica, a nomadic, semi-barbaric group from the deserts of the north, and their arrival marks the beginning of our journey towards the last great Mesoamerican empire. This is the story of Aztec origins and migration, a tale that is a blend of historical fact and founding myth, a sort of ancient origin story that every Aztec child would have known by heart. According to their legends, the Mexica were originally from a mythical land called Aztlan, the place of the herons. They were guided by their ferocious patron god, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, who commanded them to leave their homeland and seek a new one. Their long migration, which is chronicled in codices like the Botorini Codex, was a period of wandering, of living on the fringes, and of constantly being on the move. They were, for all intents and purposes, social outcasts, seen as crude and uncivilized by the more established city-states that had inherited the legacy of the Toltecs. The Mexica's journey was not a peaceful one. They were a tough, militaristic people, a bit like the ancient equivalent of a biker gang that just keeps showing up and causing trouble. They would hire themselves out as mercenaries to more powerful city-states in the Valley of Mexico, gaining a reputation for their ferocity in battle. This was a crucial period of learning and adaptation for them. They learned the political intricacies of the valley, the art of alliance, and the importance of ceremony. They adopted the gods and traditions of the more established cultures, transforming themselves from a band of wandering warriors into a people with a future. It was a kind of brutal, on-the-job training program for empire building. Their journey finally came to an end when they arrived at the shores of Lake Texcoco. The legend says that Huitzilopochtli gave them a sign. They were to build their city on the spot where they saw an eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a snake. This, as you might have guessed, is the symbol on the modern flag of Mexico. The Mexica found this sign on a small swampy island in the middle of the lake, a seemingly inhospitable location that no one else wanted. It was a terrible spot for a city, really, but it was their spot. In 1325 CE, they began the arduous process of building their new home, which they named Tenochtitlan. The choice of location was both a curse and a blessing. The swampy island was hard to build on, but it was also highly defensible. It protected them from their more powerful neighbors and forced them to become masters of engineering. They built causeways to connect their island city to the mainland, and they created a system of chinampas, or floating gardens, to expand their agricultural base. This ingenuity allowed them to turn a hostile environment into a powerful asset. It was the ultimate started from the bottom, now we're here story, but with a lot more mud and a lot less auto-tune. The founding of Tenochtitlan marks the end of their long migration and the beginning of their rise to power. However, they were still a weak city-state, a vassal to the more powerful city of Azcapotzalco. For the next century, they would pay tribute and serve as mercenaries for their overlords. But they were learning, growing, and biding their time. The Mexica never forgot where they came from, and they never forgot their patron god's promise of a great destiny. Their humble origins, their legendary migration, and their perseverance in the face of adversity would become central to their national identity. And in a surprising turn of events, a series of political maneuvers and military victories would soon put them in a position to fulfill that destiny and forge an empire that would dominate central Mexico in a way that no one had since Teotihuacan. The humble beginnings of the Mexica on a swampy island would have made their eventual rise to power seem impossible to their contemporaries. But by the early 15th century, the stage was set for a dramatic reversal of fortune. The Mexica, or as they would later be known, the Aztecs, were still vassals of the powerful city-state of Azcapotzalco. But their military prowess and growing population were becoming too significant to ignore. The balance of power in the Valley of Mexico was shifting, and in 1428, a young and ambitious king of Tenochtitlan named Itzcoatl seized the opportunity to change the course of history forever. He forged an alliance with two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, to overthrow their shared overlord. This alliance, known as the Triple Alliance, was the birth of the Aztec Empire. This was a brilliant political and military move. Itzcoatl, with the help of his brilliant military general Tlacaelel, led the combined forces in a decisive victory against Azcapotzalco. But unlike previous alliances, this one wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about creating a new kind of empire. The three cities of the Triple Alliance agreed to rule the Valley of Mexico together, with Tenochtitlan and Texcoco as the senior partners and Tlacopan as the junior. They would divide the spoils of war and the tribute from conquered lands among themselves. It was an ingenious system of shared power that allowed them to expand rapidly and efficiently. The formation of the Triple Alliance was just the beginning of the Aztecs' meteoric rise. Over the next century, Tenochtitlan, as the de facto leader, would embark on a relentless campaign of military expansion. The Aztec army was a disciplined and fearsome force, and their goals were clear: to conquer new territories, to secure tribute from defeated cities, and to capture prisoners for ritual sacrifice. This was an empire built on the back of conquest and tribute, a sort of protection racket on a massive scale. If a city resisted, it would be met with overwhelming force. If it surrendered, It would be forced to pay an annual tribute, often in the form of maize, cotton, gold, or even obsidian blades. The tribute system became the lifeblood of the empire, fueling the growth of Tenochtitlan and the power of its rulers. The empire was not a unified, homogeneous state like the Roman Empire. Instead, it was a loose collection of tributary states, each with its own local ruler who was allowed to maintain a certain degree of autonomy as long as the tribute flowed to the capital. This system worked well for a while, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflict. When a new king came to power in Tenochtitlan, he would often have to launch a new campaign of conquest to prove his military prowess and reassert the empire's dominance. This created a cycle of violence and expansion that kept the empire growing, but also made it vulnerable to internal dissent. A fascinating scholarly debate revolves around the nature of Aztec conquest. Was it purely for tribute and power, or was there also a religious motivation, a need for captives for human sacrifice? The answer is likely a bit of both. The need for captives for ritual sacrifice, a practice that was central to Aztec religion, provided a constant justification for warfare. The Flower Wars were a particularly interesting example of this. These were prearranged, ritualized battles between the Aztecs and their rivals, fought not for territorial gain, but to capture prisoners. It was a sort of showdown at high noon for the gods, where the goal was to take captives for sacrifice rather than to completely destroy the enemy. This blend of realpolitik and religious fervor made the Aztec Empire a unique and terrifying force. By the time of the last great emperor, Moctezuma II, the Aztec Empire stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean, an immense domain that was the envy and the fear of all its neighbors. The Triple Alliance had succeeded beyond its wildest dreams, transforming a humble city on an island into the center of a vast and powerful empire. But as the empire grew, so did the resentment of its conquered peoples. The heavy tribute demands and the constant threat of war created a deep well of animosity, a simmering discontent that would eventually prove to be the empire's greatest weakness. The stage was now set for the final act of this grand story, and the arrival of a few ships on the horizon would soon put this magnificent and fragile empire to the ultimate test. The Aztec Empire, forged through conquest and fueled by tribute, was more than just a collection of conquered city-states. It was a complex, highly organized society with a rich spiritual life. To understand the Aztecs is to understand their elaborate social structure and the central role that religion played in every aspect of their lives. This is a story of powerful priests, noble warriors, and a belief system that demanded a constant flow of blood to keep the sun in the sky. At the top of the social pyramid was the emperor, or Hueyatlatlatoani, the great speaker. He was not just a political ruler, but a living god, a direct descendant of the deities. Below him were the nobility, Pili, who held positions of power in the government, the military, and the priesthood. They lived in lavish palaces, enjoyed special privileges, and were educated in separate schools. The warriors, especially those who had captured many enemies in battle, were a particularly respected and powerful class, often granted land and high status. This was a society where military success was a direct path to upward mobility. You could say it was the ultimate meritocracy, but with more feathers and human sacrifice. The vast majority of the population were commoners, Makewali, who worked the land, served as artisans, and formed the backbone of the army. They lived in organized family groups, or kalpali, which also served as administrative and tax-collecting units. There was also a small class of merchants, the Pochteca, who were a powerful and secretive group, often acting as spies for the emperor and traveling long distances to trade for exotic goods. At the very bottom of the social ladder were the slaves, often prisoners of war or individuals who had sold themselves into servitude to pay off a debt. However, Aztec slavery was not a permanent condition, and slaves could buy their freedom or even marry into the families of their owners. But the heart and soul of Aztec society was its intricate and demanding religion. The Aztecs had a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, many of whom were adopted and adapted from earlier Mesoamerican civilizations like the Olmec and Teotihuacan. The most important deity was Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, who had guided them on their long migration. Another was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of learning and creation, a deity whose legend of a promised return would have profound and tragic consequences. There was also Tezcatlipoca, the god of the night sky and the patron of warriors, and Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and fertility. The Aztec cosmos was a fragile place, constantly under threat of destruction. To prevent the sun from dying and the world from ending, the gods had to be nourished with the most precious substance on earth, human blood. This belief led to the practice of human sacrifice, a ritual that, while horrifying to us today, was a deeply serious and central part of their religious life. The sacrifices were performed in grand ceremonies atop the Great Pyramids of Tenochtitlan, with the victims often being prisoners of war. The heart of the victim was removed and offered to the sun god, and the body was often thrown down the stairs, a spectacle that was meant to awe and terrify both the Aztec populace and their rivals. A fascinating scholarly debate surrounds the scale and purpose of Aztec sacrifice. Were the Aztecs truly as bloodthirsty as the Spanish chroniclers claimed, or was it a form of religious and political control that was exaggerated by their conquerors? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While the Spanish did have a vested interest in portraying the Aztecs as barbaric to justify their conquest, the archaeological evidence, including the recently discovered Hueyitzompantli, Great Skull Rack, in Mexico City, confirms that the practice was indeed widespread and on a massive scale. It was a core part of their belief system, a grim but necessary contract with the gods. It was a practice that, while terrifying, was also a powerful tool for political control, a constant reminder to their conquered peoples of the consequences of rebellion. The Aztec world was a place of vibrant artistry and profound intellectual achievement. But it was a world that was also built on a foundation of blood and fear, a paradoxical combination that would define their final days. The beating heart of the Aztec Empire was the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan. The city, founded on the island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. At its peak, Tenochtitlan was a metropolis of staggering scale and beauty, a city that truly rivaled the great capitals of Europe in both size and sophistication. When the Spanish first laid eyes on it, they were utterly mesmerized, describing it as a city of dreams, an almost unbelievable vision of causeways, canals, and towering pyramids rising from the lake. To understand the Aztecs is to take a walk through this city and marvel at the ingenuity that created it. The city was a masterwork of urban planning and engineering. The island was divided into four main quadrants, with the ceremonial center, which housed the magnificent Templo Mayor at its core. Radiating out from the center were long, wide causeways that connected the city to the mainland. These causeways were not just roads, they were also dikes, designed to control the flow of water and prevent the city from flooding. They were also wide enough for multiple people and goods to travel on, making them the ancient equivalent of a multi-lane highway. But what truly made Tenochtitlan a marvel was its ability to feed its massive population. The Mexica had turned the swampy lake into a productive agricultural zone using an ingenious technique called chinampas, or floating gardens. These were rectangular plots of land created by weaving reeds and sticks together, piling on mud from the lake floor and planting crops on top. The chinampas were incredibly fertile, allowing the Aztecs to grow maize, beans, squash, and other crops year-round. It was a form of permaculture that was both highly productive and environmentally sustainable. Imagine a city that could feed itself from the land it created out of a lake. It's a breathtaking feat of human ingenuity. Daily life in Tenochtitlan was a bustling, vibrant affair. The city was crisscrossed by canals, and thousands of canoes served as a sort of public transit, moving people and goods around the metropolis. The central market of Tlatelolco, which was an independent city-state that was eventually absorbed by Tenochtitlan, was a sight to behold. A Spanish chronicler, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, described it as being so large that he couldn't see all of it in a single day, with thousands of vendors selling everything from exotic goods like jaguar skins and tropical feathers to everyday necessities like obsidian tools, pottery, and food. The market was a true economic engine, a hub of commerce and cultural exchange that drew people from all corners of the empire and beyond. It was like a massive ancient shopping mall, but with way more bartering. Tenochtitlan also had a sophisticated system of sanitation and public services. A massive aqueduct system brought fresh water from the mainland, and public latrines and garbage collection were a normal part of life. The streets were swept clean every day, and the city was remarkably orderly and well-maintained. This level of urban organization was far ahead of many of the cities in Europe at the time, which were often dirty, disease-ridden, and chaotic. The social structure we discussed earlier was on full display in the city. The emperor lived in a massive palace complex with intricate gardens and even a zoo. The nobility lived in large multi-room houses, while the commoners lived in more modest family compounds. The city was a perfect reflection of the empire itself. Highly organized, incredibly wealthy, and built on a foundation of both ingenuity and the brutal realities of a stratified society. A scholarly debate that still goes on is just how big Tenochtitlan was. While we have rough estimates, the true size of the population is hard to pin down. Was it 100,000 people, as some scholars suggest? Or was it closer to 200,000, or even more, as others argue? The number is crucial, as it tells us just how powerful and resource-intensive the Aztec Empire truly was. What's not in question, however, is that this island city was an incredible achievement, a testament to the power of human will and organization. But this magnificent city This jewel of the Mesoamerican world was living on borrowed time. The very location that had made it so defensible would eventually make it so vulnerable, and the arrival of a handful of foreigners would soon spell its doom. While the Aztec Empire was at its zenith in central Mexico, a story of an entirely different kind was unfolding thousands of miles to the south in the rugged, towering mountains of the Andes. This is a story that, while not strictly Mesoamerican, provides a crucial parallel and a fascinating contrast to the civilizations we've been discussing. This is the story of the Inca, a people who, from a humble city in the highlands, would go on to forge the largest empire in the Americas. This is a tale of incredible ambition, stunning engineering, and a rapid rise to power that would eventually meet a similar fate to the Aztecs. The Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu, which means the four quarters together, began as a small city-state centered around the city of Cusco, in what is now Peru. For a long time, the Inca were just one of many small kingdoms in the highlands, a bit like the Mexica before they formed the Triple Alliance. Their true expansion began in the mid-15th century under the leadership of a powerful and charismatic emperor named Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui. Pachacuti, whose name means earth-shaker, was the visionary who transformed the Inca from a regional power into a vast and well-organized empire. Pachacuti's story is one of a military genius and a master administrator. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a city planner, a religious reformer, and a brilliant political strategist. He expanded the empire through a combination of military conquest and shrewd diplomacy, often offering rival kingdoms a choice: join the Inca peacefully and benefit from their vast resources and organization, or face the full might of their army. For those who resisted, the outcome was often brutal, with entire populations being forcibly relocated to prevent future rebellions. This policy, known as mitma, was a key part of their consolidation, a way to break up local allegiances and integrate the conquered peoples into the Inca state. It was a bit like a pre-internet version of a social engineering project, but with a lot more walking. The Inca Empire was a masterpiece of administrative organization. The emperor, or Sapa Inca, was considered a descendant of the sun god Inti and ruled with absolute authority. He was supported by a large and complex bureaucracy that managed every aspect of life, from food production to public works projects. The empire was divided into 4 provinces, each with its own governor, who reported back to Cusco. The Inca kept meticulous records of population, tribute, and resources, not with a written script like the Maya, but with a unique and fascinating system of knotted cords called quipu. The quipu is one of the great open mysteries of the Inca. It consisted of a main cord with a series of smaller colored strings hanging from it, and a complex system of knots and colors was used to record data. While we can now decipher some of the basic mathematical information, like numbers and dates, the full extent of the quipu's capabilities remains a puzzle. Could it have been used to record stories, poetry, or historical events? The scholarly debate rages on, but what is clear is that it was an incredibly effective way to manage a vast and diverse empire without a formal written language. The Incas' consolidation of power was a remarkable achievement, especially considering the unforgiving geography of their empire. It stretched over 2,000 miles, from modern-day Ecuador to central Chile, encompassing a staggering array of environments, from coastal deserts to high-altitude plains and dense jungles. To manage this empire, they had to be master engineers, building a system of roads and a sophisticated communication network that was unparalleled in the ancient world. This was an empire that, like the Aztecs, was born from a small city-state and grew into a massive power, all through a combination of military force, political acumen, and an astonishing level of administrative brilliance. The Inca Empire's rapid expansion was made possible by one of the most stunning engineering feats of the ancient world: a sprawling and sophisticated system of roads. The Incas' road and communication system was the nervous system of their empire, a network of highways that crisscrossed the Andes and connected the far-flung corners of their domain to the imperial heart of Cusco. It was this network that allowed them to move armies, dispatch administrators, and transport goods with astonishing efficiency, turning a vast and mountainous landscape into a single cohesive state. The Inca road system, known as Capac Ñan, or Royal Road, was a marvel of planning and construction. It was not a single road, but a network of thousands of miles of trails, causeways, and bridges that ran parallel to the coast and through the spine of the Andes. The roads were often paved with stone, and in some places, they were carved directly into the sides of mountains. They were built with an almost obsessive attention to detail, with retaining walls to prevent erosion and drainage systems to divert water. To cross the deep gorges and rushing rivers of the Andes, the Inca built magnificent suspension bridges woven from reeds and fibers. These bridges, which had to be replaced every year or so, were so strong that they could support the weight of entire armies. This road system was not designed for wheeled vehicles. The Inca, like all Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations, did not use the wheel for transportation, but for foot traffic. It was primarily used by the Inca army and a class of highly trained runners known as chasqui. These runners were the empire's postmen, and they operated in relays, sprinting from one way station or tampu to the next. The system was so efficient that a message could travel from the capital of Cusco to the far reaches of the empire and back in a matter of days. An incredible feat of ancient logistics. The chasqui also carried goods and fresh food for the emperor, ensuring that he could have fresh fish from the coast delivered to his table in the mountains in less than 48 hours. It was a level of rapid communication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. But the roads were only part of the communication network. The Incas' famous quipu was the other half. These knotted cords were not just used for record keeping. They were also a crucial tool for communication. The quipu kamayok, or keepers of the quipu, were a special class of officials who were trained to create and interpret these complex records. A chasqui runner carrying a verbal message might also carry a quipu with a numerical record of the goods being transported or the soldiers being mobilized. This allowed for the transmission of both qualitative and quantitative information over vast distances. A brilliant workaround for the lack of a formal written language. The scholarly debate about the quipu is one of the most fascinating in all of ancient history. Was it simply a mnemonic device, a way to remember numbers and lists? Or was it a more complex form of communication, a sort of proto-writing that we have yet to fully decipher? The debate has profound implications for our understanding of the Inca mind and their ability to organize their empire. If they could record stories and histories on the quipu, then our entire understanding of their culture would have to be revised. It's a bit like finding a computer without a keyboard and trying to figure out how it works. The roads and the quipu were a reflection of the Incas' belief in a strict, centralized order. The state was everything, and the individual was a part of a well-oiled machine. This level of organization was a double-edged sword. It allowed them to create a vast and prosperous empire, but it also made them incredibly vulnerable. The entire system was dependent on the Sapa Inca, the head of state. Without him, the whole thing could fall apart. And as we will soon see, that's exactly what would happen. The roads that had once carried messages of imperial might would eventually carry the news of its downfall. The Inca Empire's administrative and engineering prowess was only one side of the coin. The other was its intricate religion and social structure, which were woven together into a single, cohesive worldview. At its core, Inca society was a strictly hierarchical and deeply religious state, where every individual had a role and every action had a cosmic significance. It was a world of powerful deities, venerated ancestors, and a social system that, while seemingly fair, was ultimately designed to serve the needs of the state. The very top of the social pyramid was occupied by the Sapa Inca, the emperor, who was considered the living son of Inti, the sun god. This divine lineage gave him absolute power and authority. He was the head of the government, the military, and the religious hierarchy all at once. The queen or Koya was his sister, a tradition meant to keep the royal bloodline pure and sacred. Below the emperor was a nobility of both royal blood and appointed officials who managed the vast bureaucracy and ruled the provinces. This elite class enjoyed a life of privilege and luxury, living in grand palaces and wearing the finest textiles. The vast majority of the population were commoners, or hatunruna, who were organized into a system of family-based clans called Ailu. The Ailu was the basic unit of society, a community that shared land and labor. All land belonged to the Sapa Inca, and it was divided into three parts: one for the state, one for the gods, and one for the Ailu to cultivate. The commoners were expected to work all three, a form of taxation known as mita, or labor tax. This was a system of reciprocal obligation. In exchange for their labor, the state provided them with food during times of famine, security from invaders, and access to the vast road system. It was a well-oiled machine, and everyone knew their place within it. But the Inca cosmos was not just a world of emperors and commoners. It was also a world alive with deities and spirits. Inti, the sun god, was the most important deity, and the Sapa Inca was his direct representative on Earth. The moon, the stars, the thunder, and the earth itself all had their own deities. But the most intimate and pervasive form of worship was directed at the huacas, sacred objects or places that were believed to house spirits. A huaca could be anything from a mountain peak or a spring to a specially carved stone or the mummy of an ancestor. The mummified remains of past emperors, in particular, were treated as living beings. They were brought out during important ceremonies, consulted for advice, and had their own palaces and servants. It was a fascinating and deeply personal form of ancestor veneration. This reverence for the past and for the ancestors is a fascinating point of comparison to the Mesoamerican cultures. While the Aztecs also revered their ancestors, the Inca took it to a different level, making them a central part of their political and religious life. This is also where one of the great scholarly debates about the Inca comes in. The Inca, despite their administrative genius, never developed a true writing system. So, our understanding of their religion and social structure comes entirely from the records of the Spanish chroniclers who came later. Are these accounts accurate? Or are they colored by the biases and misunderstandings of the conquerors? It's a debate that will probably never be fully settled, but it reminds us to approach these ancient histories with a healthy dose of skepticism. The Incas' religious and social system was a powerful tool for unification. By making the Sapa Inca a living god, and by venerating the ancestors, they created a sense of shared identity and purpose that held a vast and diverse empire together. It was a system that, while impressive, was also incredibly fragile. The entire edifice rested on the power and divinity of a single person. And in a stunning twist of fate, the very idea of a divine lineage would soon be challenged by a new kind of power, a power that came from across the sea and which the Inca had no way of understanding or even imagining. The stage was set for a conflict of worlds, a clash of empires that would bring this brilliant but brittle civilization to a tragic and decisive end. The stories of the Aztecs and the Inca, of the Maya and the Zapotec, all exist within their own self-contained world. A world where the greatest challenges came from rival kingdoms, environmental shifts, or internal strife. But as the 15th century drew to a close, a new and utterly foreign element was introduced to the equation, one that would bring this ancient world to a violent and definitive end. This is the story of the first Spanish encounters, the initial moments of contact between two completely alien civilizations. It's a story that begins not with a grand invasion, but with a series of tentative explorations, driven by a powerful mix of curiosity, greed, and a fervent belief in their own divine mission. The first Spanish arrivals in the Mesoamerican world were not Hernán Cortés and his army, but rather a series of smaller expeditions that skirted the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. The first was led by Francisco Hernández de Córdoba in 1517, and his landing party was met with a rather fierce reception by the local Maya. This was their first taste of the Maya's martial prowess, and they quickly learned that this was not a land of easy conquest. The expedition, battered and bruised, returned to Cuba with tales of rich cities, impressive stone buildings, and a people who were not easily intimidated. This first encounter, while a military failure, was a stunning success in another way. It confirmed the existence of a wealthy and sophisticated civilization just a short sail away. The following year, a new expedition led by Juan de Grijalva set out to explore the coast of what is now Mexico. This time, the encounters were a bit more peaceful. Grijalva and his men sailed along the Gulf Coast, trading with the locals and marveling at the splendor of their cities. It was during this expedition that they heard the first whispers of a powerful empire in the highlands, a place of immense wealth and a king of great power. The locals, in a series of what must have been confusing and fragmented conversations, spoke of a great ruler whose name was Moctezuma, and of a city so grand it was built on an island in a lake. The Spanish were, of course, utterly captivated by these stories. The promise of gold and the potential for a vast new kingdom to claim for the Spanish crown and for God was too much to ignore. A key scholarly debate surrounding these early encounters is the mindset of both sides. For the Spanish, this was an extension of their Reconquista, a centuries-long holy war to drive the Moors out of Spain. They saw themselves as agents of God, bringing Christianity to the heathen, and in the process, getting very, very rich. They had a preconceived worldview that everything they saw, from the intricate calendar systems to the magnificent temples, was the work of the devil. For the indigenous peoples, the arrival of these strange, pale-skinned men with their beards, their metal armor, and their strange animals, horses, must have been a profoundly unsettling and bewildering event. Were they gods? Were they simply strange, powerful foreigners? The initial reactions were a mix of curiosity, awe, and, as the first expedition learned, a healthy dose of suspicion and hostility. This early period of contact, however, was just the prologue to the main event. While these initial expeditions gathered intelligence and stirred up the Spanish imagination, a much more determined and ambitious figure was waiting in the wings. This was Hernán Cortés, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cunning. He heard the stories of the rich empires and the vast stores of gold, and he began to plot his own expedition, one that would not just explore the coast, but would attempt to conquer the very heart of this new world. The stage was set, the characters were in place, and the final tragic chapter of this history was about to begin. The clash of civilizations was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was a foregone conclusion, and it would be the city of Tenochtitlan, the magnificent jewel of the Aztec Empire, that would bear the brunt of the storm. The stage had been set by the initial Spanish encounters, and in 1519, the main actor arrived. This was Hernán Cortés, a cunning and ambitious Spanish adventurer who would forever be associated with the conquest of Mexico. Unlike the earlier explorers, Cortés was not just interested in trading or scouting. He was there to conquer, to claim a vast empire for the Spanish crown, and to get rich beyond his wildest dreams. His small force of about 500 men, a handful of horses, and a few cannons seemed laughably small when compared to the might of the Aztec Empire. But Cortés possessed an uncanny ability to turn weakness into strength and to exploit the deep divisions that existed within the Mesoamerican world. Cortés's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: divide and conquer. He landed on the Gulf Coast, founded the city of Veracruz as a beachhead, and then, in a dramatic move, burned his own ships. This was a clear message to his men. There was no turning back. Their only path forward was victory or death. He then began his long, arduous march inland toward the fabled city of Tenochtitlan. Along the way, he encountered numerous indigenous groups who were either vassals of the Aztecs or bitter rivals. The most important of these were the Tlaxcalans, a fierce warrior people who had long resisted Aztec dominance. After a series of initial battles, Cortés managed to win their trust and forge a powerful alliance. The Tlaxcalans, who hated the Aztecs with a passion, became his most crucial allies, providing thousands of warriors and invaluable knowledge of the local terrain and politics. This is a key historiographic mystery. Was the conquest of Mexico a Spanish victory, Or was it a primarily indigenous one, led by the Tlaxcalans and others, with the Spanish as a catalyst and a crucial military factor? The answer is likely both. The Spanish provided the technology, steel swords, armor, and gunpowder, but the sheer force of numbers came from their indigenous allies. Without the Tlaxcalans, the conquest would have been impossible. The arrival of the Spanish was less of an invasion and more of an internal civil war, with a new, powerful faction suddenly entering the fray. As Cortés and his army marched closer, the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II, was grappling with a profound sense of uncertainty. The Aztec world was one of omens and prophecies, and the arrival of these strange men from the sea, with their pale skin and their magnificent animals, seemed to be a fulfillment of the legend of the god king Quetzalcoatl's return. According to the legend, Quetzalcoatl had been exiled and had promised to return from the east to reclaim his throne. While modern scholars largely agree that Moctezuma did not literally believe Cortés was a god, the timing and the strange appearance of the Spanish certainly caused him to hesitate and to treat them with a degree of caution. He sent gifts of gold and other treasures, hoping to appease them and convince them to turn back. A strategy that, of course, had the opposite effect. When Cortés and his allies finally entered Tenochtitlan, they were greeted not with war, but with a formal and deferential welcome. The Spanish were utterly astounded by the city's beauty and its scale. They were welcomed into the city, given a palace to stay in, and in a moment of audacious cunning, Cortés seized the opportunity to take Moctezuma captive, holding the emperor as a human shield and ruling the city through him. This precarious truce, however, could not last. In 1520, while Cortés was away dealing with a rival Spanish expedition, one of his lieutenants, Pedro de Alvarado, panicked and massacred a group of unarmed Aztec nobles during a religious festival. This sparked a furious uprising. Moctezuma was killed, and the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies were driven from the city in a desperate and bloody retreat known as the Noche Triste, or Sad Night. But Cortés was not one to give up. He regrouped with his Tlaxcalan allies, built a fleet of brigantines to control Lake Texcoco, and laid a siege to the city. The siege was brutal and lasted for months, with the Spanish and their allies slowly strangling the magnificent city. But it wasn't just the siege that was doing the damage. The Spanish had brought with them an invisible and far more deadly weapon: smallpox. The disease, to which the indigenous population had no immunity, swept through Tenochtitlan, killing a staggering number of people, including the new emperor. Weakened by disease and starvation, the city eventually fell on August 13th, 1521. The magnificent city was utterly destroyed. Its temples toppled, its canals filled in, and its people slaughtered. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just the end of an empire. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new and tragic chapter in the history of the Americas. The fall of Tenochtitlan was a seismic event, but it was by no means the end of the Spanish conquest. While the Aztec Empire had fallen, the diverse and fragmented world of the Maya still remained. The conquest of the various Maya kingdoms was a very different and far more protracted affair than the rapid, centralized collapse of the Aztec capital. There was no single emperor to capture, no single city whose fall would bring down the entire civilization. Instead, the Spanish had to contend with dozens of independent city-states, each with its own ruler, its own army, and its own deep-seated traditions of resistance. The Spanish conquest of the Maya began in earnest in 1524, led by Pedro de Alvarado, the same man who had precipitated the uprising in Tenochtitlan. He marched into the highlands of Guatemala with a mix of Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies from central Mexico. Here he encountered the powerful Quichus Maya kingdom, which, much like the Tlaxcalans, had been a rival of the Aztecs. The Quichus put up a fierce resistance, but they were no match for the Spanish cavalry and steel weapons. Their capital city of Cumacaj was eventually burned to the ground, and their king was executed. This was a pattern that would repeat itself time and again. A series of brutal, pitched battles against one kingdom, a conquest, and then a difficult, slow, and often bloody campaign to subdue the next. The conquest of the Maya was not a single, grand campaign. It was a series of regional wars that stretched over a century and a half. The Spanish, who had a clear hierarchy and a unified purpose, were able to exploit the ancient rivalries that existed between the various Maya city-states. They would often form alliances with one kingdom to conquer another, only to turn on their allies later. The conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula, for example, was a long, brutal affair that lasted for decades, with the Spanish forces led by the Montejo family facing a determined resistance from the Maya people. The Spanish had a clear advantage in technology, but the Maya knew the jungle, and they used it to their advantage, waging a relentless and effective guerrilla war. A key scholarly debate surrounding the conquest of the Maya is the long-term impact on Maya culture. Was it a complete cultural erasure, or was it more a story of resilience and adaptation? The evidence suggests a fascinating and complex mix of the two. While the Spanish did introduce new forms of government, new religions, and new diseases that decimated the population, the Maya people did not simply disappear. Their language, their beliefs, and many of their traditions endured, often in secret or blended with new Spanish ideas. The conquest was a violent and transformative event, but it was not a cultural death sentence. The final conquest of the last independent Maya kingdom, the Itza kingdom of Tayasal in the Petén region, didn't happen until 1697. This small, isolated kingdom had managed to survive for over 150 years by simply being too remote and too difficult to reach. It was a testament to the sheer resilience of the Maya people, and a powerful reminder that their history was not just a story of collapse, but also a story of survival. The Spanish may have conquered their cities and their kingdoms, but they never fully conquered their spirit. And it was during these protracted conquests that the Spanish, in their zeal to destroy the old ways and convert the indigenous population, committed one of the great cultural tragedies of the era. The Spanish friars, in their efforts to wipe out what they saw as devil worship, systematically burned almost all of the Maya books or codices. These books, which contain the histories, genealogies, and scientific knowledge of the Maya, were a priceless record of their civilization. Only 4 of them survived, and they are now one of our only direct windows into the pre-Columbian Maya mind. This act of cultural destruction is a painful reminder of what was lost during the conquest, a tragic end to thousands of years of recorded history. As the Spanish were slowly and brutally consolidating their power in Mesoamerica, a similar, though though perhaps even more dramatic, story was unfolding thousands of miles to the south, in the Andes. This is the tale of Pizarro and the fall of the Inca, a conquest that in many ways mirrored that of the Aztecs, but with an even more stunning and decisive climax. It is a story of a single, audacious act of betrayal that brought the largest empire in the Americas to its knees. The key figure in this story is Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish conquistador who, like Cortés, was a man of immense ambition and ruthlessness. He had heard the tales of the Incas' immense wealth, and after several unsuccessful attempts, he finally led an expedition into the heart of the Inca Empire in 1532. Pizarro's force was even smaller than Cortés's, consisting of less than 200 men. But he was also a master of strategy, and he was about to get incredibly lucky. He arrived at the worst possible time for the Inca, and the best possible time for him. The Inca Empire was in the midst of a devastating civil war. The great emperor Huayna Capac had died a few years earlier, not in battle, but from smallpox, a disease that, like in Mesoamerica, had raced ahead of the Spanish and decimated the indigenous population. His death had sparked a brutal war of succession between his two sons, Huascar and Atahualpa. Atahualpa had just emerged victorious, but the empire was still reeling from the conflict and the devastating plague. The civil war had not only weakened the Inca militarily, but had also sowed deep divisions and resentments within the empire, a fracture that Pizarro was about to exploit with cold, clinical efficiency. In November of 1532, Pizarro and his men, having marched for months through the unforgiving Andes, arrived at the city of Cajamarca. Atahualpa, having just won his civil war, was resting with his vast army of 80,000 men. The emperor saw Pizarro's small force as an insignificant curiosity, a few strange men who could be easily dealt with. He agreed to meet Pizarro in the central plaza of Cajamarca, but he did so with an arrogance that would prove to be his undoing. He arrived with a procession of thousands of unarmed attendants, a show of power that he thought would intimidate the small Spanish force. Pizarro, however, had other plans. He had set a trap. The Spanish were hidden in the buildings surrounding the plaza, and when a Spanish friar came out to meet Atahualpa and presented him with a Bible, demanding that he convert to Christianity, the emperor, who had never seen a book before, threw it to the ground. This was the signal. With a battle cry of Santiago, the Spanish, with their cannons and their steel swords, burst from their hiding places and unleashed a terrifying barrage of fire and steel on the unarmed Inca. The shock and awe of the attack were overwhelming. The Inca, having never seen anything like it, were thrown into a panic. In the ensuing chaos, Pizarro's men managed to seize the emperor, taking him captive while thousands of his people were slaughtered. The capture of Atahualpa was the single most decisive moment in the conquest. With their divine ruler held hostage, the Inca were paralyzed. Atahualpa, hoping to buy his freedom, offered Pizarro a ransom that is now the stuff of legend. He promised to fill a large room with gold and 2 more with silver. The Inca people, in a desperate attempt to save their emperor, brought in a staggering amount of treasure from all corners of the empire. Pizarro took the ransom and, in a final act of betrayal, had Atahualpa executed anyway, after a sham trial in which he was convicted of trumped-up charges. The death of Atahualpa was the death blow to the Inca Empire. Without their divine leader, the social and political structure of the empire, which was so dependent on the Sapa Inca, simply fell apart. The Spanish, with their indigenous allies and their superior technology, were able to consolidate their control. But the conquest of the Andes, much like the conquest of the Maya, was a long, brutal, and bloody affair. The fall of the Inca was a stark reminder that even the most powerful and well-organized empire could be brought down by a combination of internal division, disease, and a well-timed, brutal act of betrayal. The age of the great indigenous empires was now well and truly over. The conquest of the great indigenous empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes was a violent, traumatic, and irreversible event. But the end of these empires was not the end of their people or their culture. Instead, a new and fascinating chapter began, one of cultural blending, adaptation, and a persistent, quiet resistance. This is the story of syncretism and cultural survival, a tale of how ancient traditions and beliefs found a way to persist, even under the crushing weight of Spanish colonialism and the zealous mission of the Catholic Church. The Spanish, in their quest to conquer and convert, were faced with a daunting task. They could conquer the land and the people, but they couldn't erase thousands of years of deeply held beliefs and practices overnight. Their solution was to replace the indigenous pantheon with the Christian one. The great temples were torn down, and on top of their foundations, Catholic churches were built. The indigenous gods were demonized and replaced by Christian saints. The rituals and ceremonies were outlawed. The goal was nothing short of a complete cultural and spiritual erasure. But the indigenous people were masters of adaptation. Instead of simply abandoning their old beliefs, they found ways to merge them with the new. This process, known as syncretism, is visible everywhere in the modern-day cultures of Mexico and Central and South America. An ancient god of fertility might be reinterpreted as a Christian saint who brings a good harvest. An ancient ritual site might become a pilgrimage site for a local Virgin Mary. The sacred colors and symbols of the old religion were quietly woven into the new, creating a vibrant and unique cultural mosaic that was both indigenous and Spanish at the same time. A great example of this is the veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. The story goes that the Virgin Mary appeared to a man named Juan Diego on the hill of Tepeyac, a site that had long been a place of worship for the Aztec mother goddess Tonantzin. This blending of the indigenous goddess with the Christian Virgin Mary made her an incredibly powerful and beloved figure for the indigenous population, a familiar and comforting face in a new and hostile religious landscape. She became a symbol of a new, hybrid identity, a figure that was both their own and part of the New World Order. This cultural survival wasn't just a matter of religion, it was also a matter of language and social custom. While the Spanish imposed their language and their social hierarchy, many indigenous languages continued to be spoken, often in the remote highlands where the Spanish presence was less pervasive. Traditional forms of communal labor, like the Inca's mita, found a way to continue under the guise of community service or religious festivals. The ancient traditions of herbal medicine and a deep respect for the natural world continued, often in secret, passed down from generation to generation. A central historiographic mystery of this period is the role of the Spanish friars. Were they simply agents of conquest, helping to destroy the old world and impose the new? Or were some of them, in their own way, champions of the indigenous people, trying to protect them from the brutal excesses of the conquistadors and to understand their world? The historical record shows a complex mix of both. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar, famously spoke out against the brutal treatment of the indigenous population, advocating for their rights and recording their histories. However, it was also the friars who were responsible for the burning of the codices and the destruction of the temples. They were a force of both destruction and preservation, a paradox that is central to the story of the colonial period. The legacy of this period is a world where the old and the new exist side by side, a place where ancient traditions can be seen in the vibrant colors of a modern-day festival, in the quiet reverence of a church that was built on a pre-Columbian pyramid, and in the faces of the people who are the living descendants of these magnificent civilizations. The conquest was a tragic end, but the story of cultural survival is a testament to the enduring power and resilience of the human spirit. And as we look at the modern world, we can still see the echoes of the past, the silent, powerful reminders of what once was. We have journeyed from the colossal stone heads of the Olmec to the tragic final days of the Aztec and Inca, watching as empires rose and fell like waves on a shore. But the story of these civilizations doesn't end with the Spanish conquest. The legacy and enduring mysteries of Mesoamerica are all around us, in the faces of the people, in the names of the places, and in the silent, magnificent ruins that dot the landscape. The civilizations we've discussed, the Olmec, Zapotec, Maya, Teotihuacan, Toltec, and Aztec, are not just footnotes in a history book. They are a living, breathing part of the world today. The most obvious legacy is the physical one. The ancient cities, now restored from the jungle and the earth, stand as silent and powerful monuments to a glorious past. When you walk through the plazas of Monte Alban, you are walking in the footsteps of the Zapotec. When you stand atop the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, you are in the same place that pilgrims stood over 1,000 years ago. And when you look at the Great Pyramid of Colula, you are seeing a pyramid so massive that a Catholic church was built on top of it, a physical embodiment of the syncretism we just discussed, a single place where two worlds collided and merged. But the legacy is also cultural and genetic. The indigenous languages, while endangered, still survive. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, is still spoken by over 1 million people in Mexico today. The traditions of communal farming, the deep respect for maize as a sacred plant, and the rich traditions of weaving, pottery, and art are still a part of daily life in many communities. The names of the places, like Mexico and Guatemala, are derived from these ancient languages. The bloodlines of the Aztec and Inca nobility and of the Maya and Zapotec people run in the veins of millions of people throughout the Americas. This is a powerful and personal legacy, a direct link to the past that is not just a matter of history, but of identity. And then there are the mysteries, the questions that continue to captivate archaeologists and historians to this day. We still don't know who built Teotihuacan, the largest city in the Americas, or why it so suddenly collapsed. We still don't fully understand the meaning of the Olmec colossal heads, or why the classic Maya abandoned their great cities. The enigma of the Inca quipu, a system of knotted cords that served as their only form of record keeping, remains a puzzle that we may never fully solve. These mysteries are a humbling reminder that even with all of our modern technology and our brilliant minds, the past still holds its secrets close. The grand narrative of Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations is one of incredible human ingenuity, of complex social structures, of breathtaking art, and of a profound connection to the cosmos. But it is also a story of constant change, of a cycle of rise and fall, and of a final tragic end at the hands of a new and utterly foreign power. It is a story that, like the stories of all great civilizations, reminds us that nothing lasts forever. But it also reminds us that nothing is ever truly lost. The echoes of these great civilizations still resound in the world, in the majestic ruins, in the vibrant cultures of today, and in the enduring mysteries that continue to call to us from the past. And as the last whispers of this story fade into the darkness, we can rest assured that these ancient worlds, so full of wonder and tragedy, will continue to live on, not just in our books and our museums, but in our minds and our hearts, a testament to the incredible and enduring power of human history. And so, as the sun sets on these ancient empires, a new world, a new history was born. The stones of the pyramids still stand, but the jungle has reclaimed its own, and the stories of the people who built them have become part of the very landscape itself. Woven into the fabric of the earth, we have walked with divine kings and humble farmers. We have seen empires rise from nothing and crumble into dust, and we have witnessed a collision of worlds that forever changed the course of history. Now, as the long, beautiful arc of this story comes to a close, let your mind drift away from the temples and the warriors, from the calendars and the codices, and let it settle on something quiet and calm. The moon is out, casting a silver light on the world, and the sound of the wind whispers a different story now, a story of peace and of rest. The history is told, the journey is over for the night, and all that is left is the gentle rhythm of the world outside your window. Close your eyes, let your thoughts quiet down, and know that you are a part of a story that is so much bigger than you. A story that has been playing out for thousands of years. A grand, majestic tapestry that is still being woven. Sleep now, and dream of the quiet beauty of the past. A past that still has so much to tell us. Good night.